In 2021, the contemporary American left is focused on what they perceive to be the aesthetic of fascism. They fixate themselves on systemic racism, systemic sexism, systemic injustice. Everything is tied to superstructural forms of oppression. And to an extent, they have a point. So-called conservatives certainly indeed have become more defensive in clinging to the racist mythology of American exceptionalism based on puritanical pull yourselves up by your bootstraps, Judeo-Christian self-reliance values. However, before we further castigate the afflicted, we must understand the source of affliction. Material conditions are declining. Housing, fuel, food, education, medicine, they're all becoming more expensive. Good-paying jobs have become far more scarce, and competition between local communities and newcomers for low-paying jobs is a reality. Taxes are high. However, tax allocations are being doled out in the form of government handouts to private corporations and not necessarily towards public infrastructure for the benefit of all. Our commons are being gobbled up by private-public partnerships. And in the context of current events, state corporate pandemic mitigation measures, in the name of public health policy, have adversely affected more people than the actual pandemic has afflicted. Millions of people, more than the amount who have died, have lost homes, lost jobs, and lost their dreams. While major multinational retail firms, tech firms, and pharmaceutical companies dispatching their army of lobbyists in every capitalist government around the world to shape policy, rake in grotesque and obscene profits. And yes, while we must do well to understand that COVID-19 is not a hoax, we must also do well to understand that policymakers and think tanks do operate behind the scenes, strategizing machinations which enable corporations to implement social control mechanisms to benefit private interest at the expense of the public interest, and through the means of exploiting the public health crisis for as long as they can possibly do such a thing. During times of crisis, reactionary types become more defensive, more religious, more chauvinist, and more protectionist than they typically are when in calm waters. But must the left be so quick to denounce and dismiss people who clamor for stability, order, economic enrichment, and to be, just left alone in a complex social environment which goes through rapid fluctuations and vicissitudes on a day-to-day basis? To the American left, they frame this crisis as anti-fascism versus fascism. But to the reactionary, they frame the crisis as one that is national sovereignty versus globalization. And in the midst of all of this chaos and confusion, a nuanced philosophical discussion is desperately needed. The revisionist American left preaches idealism, utopianism, statelessness, and the destruction of what they perceive to be white supremacy and the social constructs that come with such. They most certainly indeed want to facilitate the destruction of the United States. What they fail to realize are that these values are in line with free market principles. Multinational corporations have embraced long-term vision of a borderless, stateless, decolonized, inclusive planet where one can experience ultimate freedom so long as the resources are monopolized and tightly under the control of multinational corporations. Who needs restrictive nation states, traditions, cultures, when private interests can run the world and offer the individual unlimited expression and unlimited freedom for a price? The reactionary right views this vision as communism, when privatization is anything and everything but communist. But don't tell that to the contemporary and revisionist American left. While they may care about fighting fascism, they care not one iota about destroying neoliberalism when they are neoliberalism's accomplices. On the flip side, you got these overly chauvinistic Proud Boys talking about saving Western civilization from communism on one hand, and on the other hand, they are openly denouncing the very capitalist Amazon, Walmart, and pharmaceutical companies for forcing vaccine compliance and diversity. They denounce critical race theory as some form of communist indoctrination when CRT was specifically designed by academia to make the very free market ideology they claim to defend to be more accessible to historically marginalized groups, to prevent those historically marginalized groups from embracing socialist ideologies that these Proud Boy folks claim to be opposed to. Yes, isn't that something? On one hand, the Proud Boy types criticize the deep state CIA, and on the other hand, they cheer on the deep state CIA when they attempt to stage color revolutions in Cuba and Hong Kong as a means to force their markets open. They embrace limited government and want all public utilities to be privatized, which, oddly enough, that's the same thing that the corporations that they are opposed to want. But at the same time, they want strict border controls and a police state which directly contradicts their calls for limited government and contradicts free market principles that they supposedly embrace. Then they scream for this, for this country to go back to the Judeo-Christian values that the United States was founded upon, when failing to realize that the United States adheres to Greco-Roman paganism. You look at all the buildings and statues. Just look at them. Statue of Liberty, that's one. How about the statue in front of Columbia? How about if you go to Union Station in Washington, D.C., or just look at any building in Washington, D.C., look at all of them. The statues and the buildings don't depict Judeo-Christian figures. They depict, Hercules, Jupiter, alternatively known as Zeus, Athena, Minerva, Apollo. No. They don't promote Jesus, Moses, and Mary. Sorry, that's not your history. Paganism is. And they don't want the United States to be sold out to supposedly satanic globalists, but they uphold Augusto Pinochet, who sold out Chile to satanic globalists and who threw people out of helicopters for attempting to stop the privatization of Chile's national interests to aforementioned satanic globalists. The crisis that is neoliberalism is pitting the liberal free trade globalization wing of capitalism against the conservative protectionist nationalist wing of capitalism. And it's coming to a boil. And this was witnessed particularly in Los Angeles the other day at the Proud Boys recall Newsom anti-vax rally. You have those calling themselves Antifa, being the street soldiers of the free trade capitalists, like the good trots they are, by the way, weaponized to psychologically and physically attack the dying European labor aristocracy that was sold out by the very capitalism which bought off their forebears' compliance, while those calling themselves Proud Boys are the street soldiers of the protectionists weaponized to attack historically marginalized communities, BIPOC, LGBTQ, immigrants, that of which the upper levels of capitalism are attempting to integrate into their globalist free trading ideology. Leftists fighting racists for the glory of inclusive capitalism and free trade, and racist nationalists who believe they are fighting communism while defending the very free trade ideology that they are supposedly at war with. I'm not going to take no socialist vaccine, says a Proud Boy. Well, let me tell you something. Pfizer, Moderna, and J&J are not socialist companies, you stupid libertarian troglodyte. And then Antifa person responds, if you don't take the vaccine, you're a fascist. And to that I say, oh, so if a person who doesn't feel like complying to the beck and whims of multinational pharmaceutical corporations profiting from a pandemic, they're suddenly a fascist? Well, wow, there must have been awfully a lot of fascists marching in the streets when they torched half of Seattle when the World Trade Organization met there in late 1999, right? Oh, right. Half of you weren't even alive to remember such an event because none of you even think about free trade and privatization, especially privatization of your health care. This country is in grave trouble right now, and the prospect of civil war due to political illiteracy is very real. Poisonous free market ideology has infiltrated both the progressive left and the conservative right, with both factions focusing on and emphasizing aesthetics as opposed to addressing deteriorating material conditions decimated by the forces of privatization and the invisible hand of the market. Those who attempt to come up with solutions are accused by aesthetic, obsessive progressives as being red browns, when these idiots are the very same people who would side with Margaret Thatcher for starving Bobby Sands to death in his struggle to free Ireland from the British just because Margaret Thatcher happens to be a woman in power, right? Where on the flip side, you have conservatives too drunk on the Cold War Kool-Aid to realize that it was Milton Friedman's policies that destroyed middle America, but instead they blame Clinton and Obama, calling it socialism, when they were following Friedman's free market playbook while being more inclusive this whole goddamn time. This is what our discourse has been reduced to. Add COVID into the mix, which the left refuses to address as far as crisis profiteering goes, and this will devolve into a much larger crisis that we may never recover from. It is up to sensible people to take a stand against hyper-partisanship along capitalist parameters to prevent the Civil War from happening. It is also up to sensible people to recognize that private interests have been profiting from this pandemic, and they will continue to profit so long as no one stands up to them, whether they have chosen to get vaccinated or not. Lastly, it is important for people to recognize that while modern-day fascism might wrap itself in a cloth of national chauvinism and dictatorship, like it did in the 20th century, it may also evolve to the point where it will hide behind the terms inclusion and democracy in the 21st century, because humanity never steps into the same river twice. The people united can never be defeated is not merely a hollow slogan chanted at protests. If we do not unite the working class, we will be defeated. We have much work ahead of us, and we must start working on uniting the working class now. Our future is at stake, folks. This is Comrade Pella, signing off.